we're good to go.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm sure we'll get more people coming online as we go. And just wanted to give you a quick overview of our efforts today and who we are. Basically, we are here because we care about planet Earth. We are a grassroots group of scientists, engineers, environmentalists, community organizers, academics, energy experts who care about climate and the role of nuclear in our energy future. We do not represent any industry group or any specific labor union or anything like that. We are concerned citizens for the most part. And we are not compensated by any group for our efforts. If you do support our advocacy, and you can decide after watching this teaching for clean air and reliable electricity, you may donate online at nuclearny.org. We will have a Q&A session at the end. Please post your questions on the chat window, and everyone will be put on mute during the presentation, and we will address those concerns at the end. And we want to make as much time possible for everybody to participate and get their questions answered. So I will, with that, I will hand that over to Len Rodberg, who is going to take the first session. So it will be three-part presentations, which will probably be 20 minutes each. And then we will have about up to 20 minutes or so with the Q&A. So over to you, Len.
All right, thank you very much, Isaro. I'm pleased to be here. And to talk, what I want to talk about is New York's, what has been called New York's landmark climate law. Do a little bit of analysis of it and explain how it can work a lot better than its current design. I will use a slide presentation, which I will attempt to start now. And here we go. So I hope everybody can see that. We all set?
No. You want to start the screen share?
No, the screen share didn't take, huh? Okay.
Nope.
We will try. Ah, yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. There we got it. And okay. So this is who I am. I taught urban studies for 35 years at Queens College, including teaching climate change and public policy. And I've been working on climate change since I retired 3 years ago. So the principal issue we face is, let's see, actually, I don't have it actually running. So let's get it running. Let's get it running. Okay. Move this aside. Slideshow. Okay. So the principal issue we're facing is climate change. Is the temperature is rising, and it will get to dangerous levels if we don't act. And we have to act now. We have waited long years of trying to organize, and
I have to something wrong, so I have to try something else.
okay, can you not see it?
I see everything just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I see it too.
wrong was you jiggled.
No, it might be because you just have to try.
The earphones work.
It is
Hey, Paul,
shared.
shall I mute you for a second?
Okay.
Oh man.
So we hear some music there. Is that Len, your background music, or is it Paul? You're the only ones that are not. Music is gone. Okay.
Okay, how about the slides? Can you see the slides?
We see the slides.
You can see the slides now. Okay, good. So, as I was saying, climate change is the issue we're really addressing, and the question we're addressing is how best to address the principal sources that generate climate change today, the growing temperature. We have to act now, but we should act intelligently. We shouldn't go off on wrong paths that won't lead us to where we need to go, which is, I think, as everyone understands, to eliminate the burning of fossil fuels of oil, coal, natural gas, which generate carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and methane, which is an equally, and for the short term, even more dangerous greenhouse gas. So a common belief is that we can replace these fossil fuels with the principal carbon-free renewables, the wind, solar, water power. And the question I want to address and that our group wants to address is, what is the role for nuclear power, which is also a carbon-free source, but very controversial here in the United States and in other countries. So here's how New York, and again, as I said, I'm focusing on New York and New York's new climate law. So here's how New York currently generates electricity. First of all, about 41%, the most recent year for which we have data, 41% was generated by fossil fuels, principally by oil and natural gas. Coal is now less than 1% of our energy sources. Second is nuclear, which generates almost a third of the electricity that we produce in this state. There are a number, about 5 reactors on the Great Lakes, and 2 reactors at one plant at Indian Point on the Hudson River, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then there are renewables, 26% finally of energy production, power from the Niagara Falls region. There's several powers. Wind and solar provide very sufficient 5% of total renewable total energy comes from wind power, wind upstate, wind power on land, and solar on homes and solar farms and various land lots around the state. Picture, to fill it out a bit, I would make the point that electric generation they burn oil, of course, and airplanes, aircraft, and finally we burn natural gas and oil in homes and in commercial buildings, and industry, of course, gets heat, uses electricity uses energy for all kinds of manufacturing purposes. So we've got to keep perspective. Most of what we'll talk about today is electricity, but it's only a part of the total energy picture. So here's New York's energy plan in 2015. The state under Governor Cuomo established an energy plan. The principal sources of energy in that plan are these renewable sources, solar, wind, and hydropower, particularly sun and wind, which have received great emphasis. What about nuclear? There is no mention of nuclear in either the 2015 energy plan or in the new climate law, which was passed last year in 2019. So what's the new law say? The law says that by 2030, we should obtain 70% of our electricity from renewables. Remember, it was 26%. It is 26% now. With water power and biomass, that is the burning mostly of wood, and wind and solar. That's our renewable sources today. The law says we should up that to 70%. So while water power and biomass can't grow very much, the major rivers and waterfalls are dammed. and biomass is limited. So we have to depend on increasing wind and solar. It's got to provide 48% of our electricity by 2030. That's a 10 times increase from what we have now, or 1,000% if you want to put it in those terms. Now, how would we get that? Well, we could install 8 million rooftop solar units. That currently there are about 120,000. Basically, every housing unit in the state would have to have solar units on it within 10 years. Or we'd need 2,500 solar farms. Currently, there are about 50, maybe somewhat less. Or we'd need to install 2,500 offshore wind turbines, which the state is actually planning to build some in the next few years. Currently, there are none. Rhode Island has 5. That's the only offshore wind that exists in the United States, off the shores of the United States at this point. What would it cost? It would cost nearly $100 billion to do this within 10 years. That's far beyond any sums being considered by the state. The current state budget has about $3 billion in it for various environmental projects, including addressing climate change. And even if we did that, we still wouldn't have power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, because those are intermittent energy sources. So I pose the question, is this realistic? Would we really be able to spend that much money? Would we want to? And if we did, would it work when we got there? Well, the Citizen Budget Commission doesn't think so. They are a rather prestigious group of the leading business and financial leaders and healthcare leaders, actually hospital executives in the state of New York. And they say that that to meet this law's goals would require an immense scaling up of renewables, and it's likely infeasible by 2030. That it really can't be done. And I agree. A better plan would be to count nuclear power as a carbon-free source. So let me just remind you or make clear that the law, as I said, doesn't mention nuclear. It defines renewables as solar, wind, and biomass and water power. So if we include nuclear as a carbon-free source, then one, we will have met the 70% goal as soon as we expand wind, the offshore wind that the state has already contracted for the first stages of that. We wouldn't have to build solar up at all. We would spend about 25 billion over the decade, not 100. However, the nuclear part of this plan, which is just the nuclear we now have, that 32%, is in danger. It's in danger because there's a plan underfoot, and within a week, the first unit of the Indian Point nuclear plant will be shut down. It currently provides over 25% of our downstate electricity and fully 80% of the carbon-free power we get here in New York City. It's been supplying power day and night safely and reliably. It has a capacity factor. It runs more than 90% of the time for over 46 years and could do so for years to come. However, it's to be fully shut down next year. Why? Not because 80% running well, the carbon-free power, unnecessary fears of nuclear energy. To replace the output of this one nuclear plant with renewables, we would have to quadruple the current wind and solar capacity that we have here in New York, in New York City. But instead, it's actually going to be replaced by 3 or more gas burning plants, that is by fossil fuel plants, which will lead to the emission of as much as 15 million tons of carbon equivalent greenhouse gases each year, both through burning oil and gas and through the leakage of gas that occurs in the process of drawing the gas out of the well and piping it. So what's one source of the fear? It's the notion of evacuations, the notion that if there were an accident to occur there, large areas of New York, including New York City, would have to be evacuated. This is simply false. There is no rational or scientific reason for large-scale evacuation following any kind of nuclear accident that's conceivable. Japan's evacuation at Fukushima, the evacuation itself killed more than 1,000 people, mostly elderly people in nursing homes who were removed and who died as a result of the shock and disturbance of their lives. There were no radiation-related deaths following the Fukushima meltdown of 3 reactors or of any documented illness as a result. The actual federally guaranteed, federally designed and certified accident emergency plan calls for an evacuation, if necessary, only within the first 1 to 2 miles of a site where relatively few people are living. People living downwind from where the accident might have occurred might be asked to stay in their homes for several days so that any radioactive material could settle out. But just note that in 60 years of having nuclear power operating in this country, no one has ever been killed or even injured or made ill by nuclear power. In fact, that's true worldwide since the catastrophe at Chernobyl. So our conclusion here is that it may not be what the governor wants to hear. Here is spelled wrong, but let's follow his advice. Cries for a new green movement are hollow political rhetoric if not combined with aggressive goals and a realistic plan on how to achieve them. The green movement that he's advocating has all this renewable energy, but it costs too much and won't actually work. Even in today's chaos of political pandering and hyperbole, he said, there are still facts, data, and evidence, and I've presented you some of them, and we'll give you a few more. So what are my conclusions? First, we need to take climate change seriously and have a plan that will work. We need a workable plan for New York that has to include all of its carbon-free sources, including nuclear power. Indian Point should remain open and operating. It's a crucial energy source for the New York area, a carbon-free source for our region. And finally, without Indian Point and the state's other nuclear plants, all of which are due to be shut down within the next several decades, we'll be depending on wind and solar and will not be able to meet our state's emission reduction goals. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions later. Oh, finally, here's a link to the slides I just showed. If you'd like to download them, they're freely available here at infoshare.org/Maine. How to make New York's climate law work. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Leonard. I guess I'm next. My name is Dietmar Detering. I'm originally from Germany, and where I studied, the last thing I did there was political science. I came to New York City and have been living here since 1999, doing event publishing and marketing here in the city. I would say that I'm an environmentalist since about 1988. I guess that makes me almost old. And that meant in Germany, being an environmentalist, to join the Green Party. I stayed with them and until 1996, when I came to the United States for the first time, where I studied at Virginia Tech Public Administration. When I returned back to Germany to finish my studies, I never rejoined the Green Party, and eventually realized, in particular in 2011, when Germany became serious about getting out of nuclear power, that the Green Party would not be my home. And eventually I became active again, and 15 months ago, so I joined first Nuclearia, the most important, I would say, pro-nuclear organization in Germany. And about half a year ago, I started with a few others, including Isuru Nuclear New York. And now this is our fight, protecting Indian Point. So let me start with my presentation then. With my background, it fell on me to give a little international perspective on this. My understanding here is that Indian Point really got on the chopping block after the incident in Fukushima in 2011. And we have seen similar strengthening of pro-nuclear movements in Japan and in Germany. I'm not sure whether you have been glued to the TV and seen pictures like this where the cameras were just staring at the power plant in Fukushima Daiichi and waiting for something to happen. And sure enough, something did happen. Eventually, actually 4 of these power plants showed some explosion. 3 of them melted down. And both Japan and Germany reacted strongly, forcefully in their energy policy. And we're going to review this now. Scaling down nuclear power. Sorry, I just made some edits here. You can see that on this nice comparison, we have Germany and Japan side by side. And if we look here first to Germany, you can see that Germany did not really add any more nuclear capacity from here on. This is because of the disaster in Chernobyl. Germany stopped expanding its nuclear program. And since then, basically, plants started aging out. And in the year 2000, there was a left-green government that decided to bring down nuclear power fairly quickly. That is this line here. And there was some big compensation plan and so forth. And that was the plan until 2010. Now that's about half a year before what happened in Fukushima, when Angela Merkel, who just recently gained power in Germany in like 2008 or so, she came with her plan and extended the lifetime of all these nuclear power plants up to about here. Her plan was not to add nuclear capacity, but to have the existing plants operate a little longer. Now, half a year later, there was another flip with Fukushima. Then Merkel's plan to exit quickly was this one here, the one with that's actually showing in the colored bars, where she then kind of replicated what the green social democratic government had done some 11 years before that. You can see here, this is the exit. This large drop here was due to immediate action that the government took in the days after Fukushima. For Merkel, this was very important out of election tactics. There were a few local elections coming up after in the late spring of 2011. She wanted to win those. So the Green Party was becoming very strong with the events and the attention that Fukushima got in Germany. She reacted to it. She lost those, or her party lost those elections anyway. But Germany did shut down a large number of nuclear power plants and provided a shortened lifespan for the remaining plants. In Japan, you see that the buildup of nuclear capacity continued even after Chernobyl. Chernobyl did not change Japanese plans on its nuclear buildout. But then in 2011, we can see that the capacity here started to drop. The different colors show you the cohort of when the plants had been built. You see there's no purple built in Germany. And this is, they're getting older and older. And oops, I didn't mean that. So what we see here is in part an aging out of the plants. I wanted to show you this here. So we can see here that the capacity of Japanese power plants has remained. The plants haven't necessarily been shut down right away out of political reasons, but here they're aging out. They're currently being held in capacity. We can see here that in 2011, the generation of electricity out of nuclear power dropped right away. These are annual figures, so basically this is what was left or what has been produced in this winter and spring preceding the Fukushima incident. And then by 2012, there was almost no generation out of nuclear power anymore. And it is slowly, here we can see this picking up again. And of course, Japan needed electricity, so coal, oil plants, and natural gas-fired plants had to pick this up. Renewables, we can see here, Japan does not have a significant wind energy plan, but they do build out solar photovoltaics. They planned that before Fukushima, and they're continuing to build this out. But you see, this is a very, very slow rise. The reactors that they have remaining are, well, you see on this graphic, 33. This is actually current, and 2 reactors remain under construction. So they're still adding some. The construction of these has started before the Fukushima incident. And here's the capacity. This is significant capacity. If you see here, the most recent number, I think this should be in 2018, is still over 30 gigawatts in capacity. Indian Point is just over 2 gigawatts. So this is quite a big capacity that's left in Japan, but very little is actually operating. In 2017, these plants altogether have produced 33 terawatts, which means they were running 10% of the time. But in fact, most of these plants were not running at all, just a few of them. The others are waiting in legal limbo and for permits, technical upgrades and things like that. They're considered operational, but they are not operating. Of course, I guess for our audience here and for myself, I like to look at the CO2 intensity. This is the change of how much carbon dioxide is being produced per kilowatt hour over the course of the time. And you can see here in the year 2000 that the carbon intensity is actually slowly rising. I do not know the reason for that, but between 2010 and 2012, we see a jump up. And this is almost like 40% up. And this is due to the shutdown of the nuclear power plants. It's since then dropping again a little bit. And that is mostly due to nuclear power getting back online. The Japanese policy is not a clean exit out of nuclear power. They're currently struggling to bring a number of goals together where they want to reduce the carbon intensity of their electricity production. And we can see here the plans and the realities. This is the 2010 plan, how they imagined their electricity generation in 2030. They imagined 50% of it being generated by nuclear power, much more than it was actually in 2010. And then in 2013, of course, post-Fukushima, the nuclear generation dropped to pittance. And then in 2015, and again reiterated in 2018, the nuclear power was taken back into consideration to reach climate goals and energy security for Japan. Imagine 50%. We have here the renewables. This includes hydro, whereas here it is being separated out of this and other renewables. So that they do play a role. There is some plan of building out renewables. And here, again, you can see a list of the reactors that are operating or waiting for operation. We have heard in the media recently that Japan is building out coal-fired power plants. I learned that this is basically a misunderstanding. The new coal-fired power plants that they are building are a replacement of old capacity that is more polluting and is aging out. But they are, as you can see here in this, they are keeping coal-fired capacity. They're not replacing it with renewable or with nuclear. They're just replacing it with more modern, more efficient plants. Their climate goals show the struggle with this conflict between different objectives. The the 2010 plan with 50% nuclear would have provided a very easy path to reach firm commitments to climate goals. The current climate goals are somewhat soft and somewhat disappointing. I'm not going here into the details. For 2050, Japan does not really have a firm strategy yet. They're working with 4 or 5 different scenarios. Some of them include nuclear power. Some of them consider getting out of nuclear power. And we're still waiting for a firm commitment of Japan to 2050 goals. In Germany, as you've seen, there was a little back and forth in the policy, but since there was no addition of nuclear capacity, we can see a steady and slow decline, almost observable after the last nuclear power plants have joined the grid in 1990 about, and then you can see here in this area, the nuclear share of nuclear generation in the electricity grid is continuously dropping. At the same time, you can see that wind is picking up. There's a strong wind program and solar photovoltaic program as well that is somewhat picking up what nuclear is leaving behind, but it is struggling to cut into the electricity generation based on coal, and this is oil for some reason that still exists, and we can see here a big share of biofuels coming in there, mostly, I believe, in the form of fermentation into biogas, methane, basically, to be fired into electricity directly. The carbon dioxide intensity, I'm sorry about this, copy paste error. The carbon dioxide intensity since 2000 has seen a somewhat steady drop, as you can see here. And if you consider that all this here is the generation that reflects very little carbon dioxide emission, then you can see that this year is right. If you consider that if nuclear would have expanded its share or held its share, this drop in carbon dioxide intensity would, of course, have been more pronounced. We're also looking at something else that the coal-fired power plants is responsible, and that is pollution deaths due to respiratory diseases and small particles that then cause cardiovascular diseases. This is a chart showing all the calculated deaths based on coal-fired power plant pollution in Europe. Poland is taking the lead here, but close second, Germany, with 4,350 deaths caused by coal-fired electricity generation. And these are current numbers. I think this is based on 2013, yes. Of course, not all of these deaths are taking place in the country where the pollution is. Europe is not that big, so the wind blows the dirt back and forth. You can see that a lot of these, the pollution and the health consequences are being exported, and some are imported as well, from Poland mostly. I want to cycle back here to Japan, where I found some data, not as detailed, but some data on how many people are dying. And these numbers reflect the death of from air pollution that could have been avoided if Japan and Germany would have stayed the course with nuclear power. Instead, they had to burn more fossil fuels, more air pollution, more deaths. And these numbers are somewhat confusing here. I'm sorry about that, but this number here is only 2011 to 2017, whereas this number here for Germany is, as well as the others here, going all the way to 2035 to reflect a longer horizon where nuclear power is being phased out, assuming some phase out in the United States and in the rest of Europe. But only looking at 2011 to 2017, 28,000 air pollution reduced premature deaths could have been avoided, and also 2.6 billion tons of CO2, where you can see a similar graphic here for the preventable CO2 emissions. that wrote down a few quick conclusions here. The energy policy should be considered responsive in Japan and Germany. There were widespread fears in both countries. The media supported these fears, and the public reacted, and the political system also needed to react. And the other goals of climate or of energy policy to reduce greenhouse emissions and to reduce air pollution, they took a smaller role in the political system suddenly, where the exit out of nuclear power took center stage. In Japan, as we have seen, the nuclear power is coming back. In Germany, it doesn't seem that way. Nuclear power seems to be gone for good in Germany. Yeah, so the consequences are that the air pollution remains higher than it would have been without the nuclear phase out, and the greenhouse emissions the same way. And the future path of reducing air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions to reach health goals and climate goals are very challenging and somewhat costly as well. Challenging from a technical perspective and from a monetary perspective, difficult to achieve. And we can see that with the uncertainty with the climate plans in Japan and with the struggles that Germany is showing with its current electricity production. All right, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
I think that's my cue.
Yeah.
I'm Isuru Sen. I am a energy investment professional with about 15 years experience doing that. Much like Dietmar, I grew up in outside of the US. I didn't have a actually, can you guys hear me? I know I had some challenges with
we can hear
audio.
you.
Okay, good. So yeah, so I grew up in Sri Lanka. I returned, so I worked in New York for a while. Then I returned to Sri Lanka in 2012. We decided to come back to the US partially because of the challenges or difficulties in living in a country that doesn't have high energy consumption per capita. It's invisible. We don't realize it, but it makes a material quality of life improvement to live in the places which have a lot of energy. So in 2015, I returned to the US and I set up my own firm investing in energy resources just right around the time that the Paris climate goals were announced. And that allowed me to kind of look into the energy sectors, areas that were of interest to me. So I've looked at energy storage as a key component of integrating variable renewable generation into the electric grid. I looked at hydrogen fuel cell technology, how that compares against electric vehicle, battery electric vehicles, so hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So like the clean tech side and the kind of energy resources that we need for the future. But they were all on a company level or sector level, not at a country or a region basis. But I became a kind of climate advocate for comprehensive, durable, effective, efficient, equitable climate policies since about 2017. So I've been kind of getting more into kind of the policy level analysis of climate goals and what has worked and what hasn't worked. So I have a fundamentals of sustainability accounting accreditation from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board to identify kind of material aspects of investment decisions. And I'm currently studying sustainability at the Howard University extension school, including the design of renewable energy projects. So currently, some of the presentation or some of the tools that I will deploy to put this presentation together were developed by my professor to evaluate the ancillary benefits of switching from fossil generation to clean energy sources, so wind and solar, etc. Unfortunately, in the case of New York, we are going backwards on switching from clean energy to polluting energy sources. So without further ado, we will, can you guys see the screen? I guess you can.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so we are talking about Indian Point nuclear plant. Len did a great job kind of putting that in context with the CLCPA. What I'll do is more specifically looking at the grid mix shifts that will happen due to this closure announcement, closure decision, and then look at the impacts of that. What is the actual analysis of how that impacts emissions and human health? And then look at kind of the fear of nuclear, put that in context with, put it in context so that we can make rational decisions on energy policies. So I don't come to this from like, I love nuclear. I have been actually mostly technology agnostic for the most part, but the fact that Indian Point closure is a permanent closure. Once you close it, you can't, so it's very difficult to bring it back. So that has made me very motivated in trying to keep it open because it's a one-time thing, as Germany and Japan has shown, Dietmar showed in Germany and Japan. We talked about this. So the what happened in, what is the potential outcome of this closure? So Indian Point generates 16.3 terawatt hours of electricity. And as we know, electricity is essential to running our hospitals, our schools, and our industry, everything. And so we need electricity. The question is, where is it going to come from? So what I did is I looked at all the projects. So New York State is a deregulated electricity market. What that means is everybody bids into the grid, and if the price is low enough, then you get accepted into the grid. However, wind and solar get subsidies that allow them to enter the grid, and there are zero marginal cost resources, meaning that once you build it, it doesn't matter what the price of electricity is, they get added to the grid. So this is all of the wind and solar projects that are in the New York interconnection, New York systems operators interconnection queue until end of 2021. So I add all of them together, and then to make up the difference, the generation has to come from two massive gas plants that are currently being built or coming online. And then even those things are not enough. We have to bring back old polluting plants in the New York City area to make electricity work. So it's possible that we don't need all these 16.3 trillion terawatt hours. It might be 3% less or 2% less. So however less, because we are becoming more energy efficient. But the big math is stunning. This is a near complete displacement of nuclear with methane gas-fired generation, ensuring carbon lock-in for decades. The CPV Valley plant was $1 billion project. The Cricket Valley plant is a $1.5 billion project, and they are online, and they want to get paid back their capital. So where are the renewables that have been promised as replacement or to get New York to the desired electricity mix? Len did a great job kind of setting the big picture. I looked at the specific project level assessment. So you can see Indian Point is such a giant in the field. If you, the only 3 projects match the scale or even come close to the scale. CPV Valley project, Cricket Valley project, these are massive gas plants. And then the only other thing that is upscale is Quebec hydropower, which hopefully will come in at the end of 2024, but that's been delayed due to permitting of the transmission line to get that water, get that electricity from Quebec down to Queens. The other big thing is the wind. Offshore wind is the answer that Governor Cuomo is pushing. New York State is investing substantially in trying to build wind online, but that likely won't come until December 2024, or even then, it might. Currently, the federal government is conducting an extended review of this, which has already pushed back this December 2024 number to about at least a year, possibly longer. So it's just this is the reality, not the hype. So what does that mean to our electric grid? The downstate electric grid is Len presented New York State's overall picture, which has a ton of nuclear and hydro, but most of that is upstate with the Niagara Falls, and then the nuclear plants are there upstate. But in the downstate grid, which is effectively a different zone because there's not enough transmission line to get upstate energy to downstate. So the downstate is 70% fossil powered as of now, 23% nuclear. Once the nuclear plant is supposed to go offline in 2 phases, one leg this month, and then the next one a year from now. So what I did was look at the emissions intensity per unit of electricity generation, how that changes with this grid shift. So we should be going absolutely to 0 on this count, but we are increasing that by nearly a third. But our point is why, until this fossil generation is displaced, why not keep the nuclear up and running, maybe even expand it if there's political will for it? Because what's the actual goal here is to bring these emissions down to 0, assuming that the nuclear plant is safe, and we'll get to that. So there's a lot of discussion whether renewables and energy efficiency displaces nuclear or is sufficient, there's enough renewables and energy efficiency that we can get rid of Indian Point. I don't think this makes a ton of sense. As we talked about energy efficiency, as we talked about earlier, the renewables aren't there enough to make that a viable solution as of now. But even then, the role of renewables should be to displace the fossil generation rather than switch around with zero carbon generation. Everything is going to methane gas. It went from 29% of electric share in 2006 to 40% today. And with the closure of Indian Point, it'll likely go to 50+%. So energy efficiency discussion, energy efficiency is great, and electron not used is all the externalities of that electron is not incurred. But energy efficiency says nothing about where the rest of the electrons should come from. I would contend that the rest of the electrons should come from the lowest ecological footprint sources and lowest health impact sources. We talked a little bit about this. Gas is the driver of electricity prices, and gas prices have completely collapsed with the shale revolution. New York State has banned its generation of petroleum in the state. It's fracked gas coming from Pennsylvania over to New York, and that's driven New York's electricity prices down to it was $30 a megawatt hour for average 2019, but it's close to $20 a megawatt hour today due to the pandemic issue. And this is these lines are a little maybe too much here, but what's the cost to bring on zero carbon sources or incremental energy? So rooftop solar costs about $200 per megawatt hour. Offshore wind, we are trying to get at 160. New nuclear, 158. New hydro, $70 megawatt hour. Onshore wind is becoming cheaper, but onshore wind has a lot of problems in downstate New York because we don't have the space to build huge wind farms. And then maintaining existing nuclear plants rather than building nuclear, maintaining existing is 30 to 40, say $50 per megawatt hour. So yes, it's great for consumers that electricity prices have come down, but at what cost is the question. And at what cost should we encourage or maintain zero emission or low emission sources to come in? And this chart gives some indication of that. We talked a bit about this fossil portion of electricity generation. With the closure of Indian Point, even if all the renewable projects in the queue come on time, and at the end of 2021, the grid will be 50 to 51% gas dependent. And that's 2 decades of progress that we made on the grid that we are going to just throw down the drain here. On the plus side, it's not too late. The existing closure agreement also has the provision to extend each unit for up to 4 years. We can prevent that, we can trigger that. Governor Cuomo has the authority to do that. The state has a responsibility to make, to save, to do what's right for climate and do what's right for human health. So this is not an easy challenge because there's a lot of concerns, it's not a very popular decision. It's not a safe decision, as all of us are experiencing. It's not a popular decision, but at some point, somebody has to decide it's the right thing to do. Why? Because the fossil generation plants that will displace Indian Point, this might be, I had another number, a few numbers in here. The Sibi Valley and Cricket Valley are big gas plants that are coming online to displace Indian Point, or coming online because they get more space on the grid when a large generating source goes offline. These two plants provide 30, one is about 26%, and the other one is, I have the numbers elsewhere, but I don't see it here. So I'll continue with this, but these two plants are still not enough. We talked about the need to bring on a generation from downstate plants in around Queens. And what that means is that creates pollution. So particulate pollution is combustion of not just electricity, but also automobiles. Combustion of any petroleum product creates particulate pollution. The smaller the particle, the more difficult it is for the respiratory system to remove that from your body. So the PM 2.5 are these 2.5 micron diameter particles, and the emission of those creates exacerbates cardiovascular death, which are the numbers for Japan and Germany. In New York, the displacement of clean nuclear. So it's a switch. So you switch from one source to the other. Two of these plants are here and one bunch of plants downstate. What that means is that creates extra cardiovascular disease related death. And the analysis that I talked about here shows that we are commissioning these plants that will increase cardiovascular mortality by 209 people per year when the shift happens. And this is scenario analysis. This is a recipe life cycle impact assessment that doesn't differentiate between different types of gas plants, etc. So there's a bunch of assumptions that go in there. But these are actual people's lives that are at risk due to this. The other thing is the climate aspect of it. Gas generation plants, while I used to be a supporter of gas as it displaced coal, what this chart shows is the amount of carbon generated per kilowatt hour per unit of production. What we found out over the last 2-3 years is that gas system leaks, and the leaks that the methane that leaks out, even a small fraction of methane that leaks out, has a huge impact on climate because methane is 86 times worse on a global warming basis than CO2. So as we see, there's a big chunks here. The fossil generation plants are just very difficult for climate, and the nuclear and offshore wind are extremely good on this count. Except for if you see the shaded areas, wind and solar and the variable generation plants require massive amounts of grid level storage, which does not exist today, and or gas or some kind of backup that can ramp up and down when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. As of now, given the economics, it's gas. So there's a component of emissions that are not included in this IPCC chart. This assessment is what happens in CO2 emissions on a 20-year time frame when those energy displacements in the electricity generation happen. This is who we are. This is a bunch of us, and I will switch over to questions now. And in the meantime, I'll look for my other slides, which can't seem to locate in this deck.
Okay.
Thank you, Sura.
All right, thank you all. That was great. Let's see, we have a few questions here. One is from a legal perspective, would it be possible to operate beyond a shutdown date from 4 or 5 years, or would this require a new law and so forth?
Well, Indian Point's license runs through the unit 2 runs. Each unit has a 4-year extension on its license. So in terms of federal regulation, they could go for 4 years. The governor would simply have to declare an electric emergency that we need to keep the plants running for a variety of technical and climate reasons. And it could run for 4 years, and then the license could be extended by application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because there's nothing inherent in Indian Point that limits its lifetime. There's no, as far as we can see, there's no reason to limit its lifetime at this point. It's 46 years old, and some plants like it are now licensed for 80 years.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a recent development here in the U.S., and that's something that most people don't realize, is that the original 40-year licensing was just sort of arbitrary and has nothing to do with the operational lifetime of the plants. So with Unit 2 of Indian Point, if it closes within the next 2 weeks, would it be economically viable to just keep Unit 3 running?
Certainly would be climate viable. Economically, let me remind people that the state is now subsidizing the nuclear plants up on the Great Lakes because of the drop in the price of natural gas, which overall determines the value of electricity, the way the electric market works. So the state is subsidizing them for their climate benefits and their job and economic benefits. It could do the same thing for Indian Point. The social value of a non-carbon source is very great, and it's, in our view, it certainly would be worth the subsidy to keep that carbon-free source going, even if it's only one of the reactors. It's still a gigawatt of carbon-free power.
Isuru actually has the exact answer on one of his slides. Maybe he can bring that up again. I guess he's digging through data for some other information. But it is, of course, more expensive to run only one reactor on the Indian Point nuclear reactor site instead of two. But the cost of operating only this one reactor for the amount of energy that it does produce is still the cheapest choice by far of all the other low carbon options that we have here in New York currently and for the foreseeable future. And the runners up are wind power, which need backup or some sort of storage that we don't know what that would look like. And so, yes, it would still be economically viable if your interest is in bringing down CO2 emissions. If your interest is in getting electricity as cheap as possible, then why do we even bother thinking about renewables?
Oh,
Well, I think to partial answer to that, of the leaders that have been in New York, Michael Bloomberg had been a supporter of Indian Point when he was mayor. I haven't seen much of his help on this issue of late. But
he was running for presidency, a nomination in the Democratic Party, so maybe that has something to do with that. Maybe now is the time.
Yeah.
Imagine what we could do with $1 billion that he wasted on this.
He's also author of a book on electrifying the society co-authored with Carl Pope, and it's all about renewables and doesn't have any role in it that's identified for nuclear.
Actually, this is Jan. I read the same book, and Bloomberg comes out for nuclear in that book, while Pope says no. So, yeah, I think it's a good strategy to get Bloomberg.
So I think one of the things that we kind of augmented my presentation later that I had to get it back online is the risk right, is Indian Point a dangerous plant? And that's been the stated reason. That's been the there's a lot of activism that had happened to bring about this closure agreement based on the premise that Indian Point is unsafe. Len did a great job addressing the concern of the necessity or the oft repeated mantra of needing to evacuate 20 million people in a 50-mile radius. There is no scientific basis. Len did a great job on that. But I wanted to bring that on to like some of the kind of augment that with some more work that I've done in here. I can get this up and running. So basically, the idea here is, I personally, I love swimming in the ocean, but I am petrified of sharks. I really, it scares me. Even when I know the stats on the incidence of shark attacks, I struggle against the kind of deep mammalian brain, old mammalian brain, telling me that shark attacks are scary. So this is a quirk that, for me, right? That has no impact or little impact on the world at large. But energy policy choices do matter. And not only to people living around those fossil plants today, but also to future generations, because every ton of carbon that we put into the air is there pretty much permanently. So given this reality, kind of policies need to be driven by evidence, not by gut feel. Just because I fear sharks doesn't mean that we should kill all sharks. So cardiovascular disease, this shows how kind of huge this actual reality is compared to sharks, and we talk a bit about that. So in that kind of, that's a kind of basis for a lot of these concerns that, like real concerns that people have in that, albeit from terrorism, somebody driving a plane into the nuclear plant, or earthquake risk, or there's a gas pipeline that's going to rupture around it. And these are obviously, they could happen, especially the driving a plane into things. Like the odds of these things happening are close to, I wouldn't say zero. They're not zero. It's just that all those risks they have protected against. Nuclear facility is one of the safest places from many of those actual risks that people are scared of. And so in our kind of, actually in NRDC, which had been advocating to close Indian Point, they did a study in 2011 with Riverkeeper, another anti-nuclear group, that showed even in the case of kind of extreme assumptions, 100 times more nuclear material released, radioactive material released than what the national labs say, or assumptions about people staying outside, being exposed to that radiation day and night for hours on end, which nobody does, even when in those kind of extreme assumptions, their study found 0 casualties. So it's striking how nuclear is one of the safest sources of electricity generation, and yet our fear of it is the most extreme. Other aspect of it is the material intensity per unit of electricity generation. And this is done by the DOE, the US DOE does a quadrennial technology review, and they looked at all of the kind of resources that go into making each unit of electricity. Or when you look at that, the nuclear is the lowest kind of resource intensity. But even in that resource intensity, so across the whole thing, the water use is it's used, it's not consumed. You don't lock that water up for 10 years. You change the water. If it goes from water to steam, then it changes form, but it still goes to the atmosphere. In the case of Indian Point, that the heated water is dumped into the Hudson River, which does kill fish. What's the answer is to kill all humans that possibly benefit from that electricity, or to say that's an externality we have to take into account if we are to live an energy-rich lifestyle. The other kind of last chart I want to leave you with is land use per kilowatt hour. And this is from the US National Climate Assessment that came out December, Thanksgiving 2018. The Trump administration tried to hide this. This is land use intensity per unit of electricity generation. Even then, there's nothing that comes close to nuclear. So if you're talking about the kind of amount of space that it takes to build your solar panels or your wind farms, you have to either reclaim that land from other industrial use, other agricultural use, or you have to chop down forests to make that happen. So these are the kind of some of the fact-based. These should be factored into making energy policy decisions less gut feel.
Very good. Let me just point out the newest models of reactors that are being developed and that will be installed as we expand nuclear power, which I very much hope we will, do not require being near sources of water. They can be placed any place because they're basically high temperature facilities and don't need the kind of water cooling that the older generation of reactors do.
We've got a question here from Julie Harris. She asks if there are any nuclear plants elsewhere in the US. Are they scheduled to be closed down also? And are there nationwide organizations which support nuclear power?
Well, there are 98 reactors operating in the United States at this point. A number of them are scheduled to close in the next few years. The 3 Mile Island, two of the reactors there were just closed about a year ago, and a number have been threatened with closure, and the states Ohio and Illinois have saved them by providing a small subsidy. I think somebody asked about how big is the subsidy. It's about $10 to $15 per person per resident of New York per year for each reactor. I just did a mental calculation. The cost of that offshore wind power that I was talking about earlier is about $10,000 per resident of New York over the next 10 years.
That's a bargain. I mean, think about all the frivolous things we spend money on that are more than $15 for a whole year of carbon-free energy. What a deal.
Yep.
I have heard, it's my understanding that capital cost for nuclear facility, new nuclear construction, is one of the biggest problems. So what can you all tell us about that, and what can we expect here in the near future?
Well, Isuro, you could talk about it. He showed you the figures, the cost. That's it. That's capital cost plus operating cost, and basically all of the sources we're talking about, nuclear, solar, and wind. Basically, the main cost is the capital cost of building the facility, because the fuel cost is relatively, there's no fuel cost for wind and solar, and there's a relatively small fuel cost for nuclear. But the reason nuclear is so expensive is we've added so many additional safeguards onto the reactor facilities because of public concern about reactor safety. So that reactors that were built in the 60s are still operating, and they're operating safely, but they cost, the Indian Point plant cost a tenth of what it would cost to build it today, because there have been so many extra safeguards added in the regulations of again, the newer reactors will be smaller, safer, and less costly because they'll be self-protecting. That is, if anything happens to them, they shut themselves down. It's called passive safety. It doesn't require somebody to throw a switch or some electric generator to come on, as tried and failed at Fukushima. The physical design of the reactors is such that basically if they overheat, they expand, the fission reaction stops, and they cool themselves down.
So this is a chart that comes from the Breakthrough Institute that looked at all the nuclear plants that were built in different countries. You see the US costs have gone up really exponentially. But if you see other places, costs have, even recently, right? So South Korea was the country that built the biggest nuclear fleet recently. And also Slovakia did this even beyond 2010, I believe. Yeah. And they have done it cheaply. And the way to do it is to have a national energy policy, or have a significant amount of interest, desire for these plants to be built, such that you can do it. You can deploy a bunch of the same team can go and deploy in different places. And that's the way that you can kind of use the expertise again and again. And the other idea is to use, factory generate as much as possible, so that each reactor is not a custom, first of a kind design. You have one design and you do it again and again and again.
Right. And let me add, South Korea and China are in the most recent years building a Westinghouse designed reactor, and they're building it for about $2,500 per kilowatt hour, and it's about a quarter of what's costing here in the United States.
And the question is, if climate is our goal, I mean, if climate is an existential threat to humanity and the planet, what we have to ask is, what are the ways that we can scale up decarbonization technologies in the fastest way possible? What the IPCC thinks, and what most scientists believe, is we need to cut emissions in half in 10 years' time. I mean, that's a very challenging request, and we need to cut emissions to zero by 2050. So this is a chart that looks across the board and across all energy deployment scenarios at what can scale up fast, and nuclear just wins hands down.
Do we have a number on how much energy we can create from nuclear for each dollar we spend to build it, versus how much we create from solar, wind, and renewables, since you have to build them and you have to build backup gas generation right now? So we compare the number to build and how much we create against the cost of the alternative, which, obviously the others are, the renewable sector is trying to promote. Their sector can't grow energy as fast as we can grow energy. And when you take the cost to build a nuclear plant, even if it were higher, they don't have a production system basically to produce enough electricity rapidly. And their cost, I believe, is higher when you add them both together. And how much pollution and how much CO2 do we eliminate per dollar when we invested in a nuclear plant? That's the difficulty right now. Because we can scale up nuclear. I'm an industrial engineer, by the way, and I also have a construction management company. We can produce plants and equipment much more quickly. The laws, granted, cause us a lot of problem. They do that in construction no matter where you are. But the reality here is we can form a production line to produce nuclear facilities. And that's what we need to give the scale that we need to end the environmental problems. These are never going to achieve that because they're building and adding to the problem. As they build theirs out, they keep adding more fossil fuel production.
Okay.
I mean, this chart looks at the cost, system cost, levelized cost of electricity, including or without storage. So solar and wind, I mean, you might have heard solar and wind are now cheaper than anything else, 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's true if you don't consider the balance of systems to make everything work. When you add the cost of storage, those solutions become extremely expensive. Which is not to say there's no space for it. There is obviously a place for it when there's a lot of wind, like offshore New York has a ton of wind. There's, building out nuclear is expensive, or there needs to be a lot more political will to make that happen. But saving nuclear is just such a no-brainer at this point because it's existing, it's the cheapest way to reduce our emissions, and there's no kind of logical reason to close Indian Point at this point.
So from the production standpoint, if we look at it, we're producing a piece of equipment that is going to reduce at a rapid rate for every dollar we spend the CO2 in the environment, the growth of that CO2, and potentially the reduction of it through sequestration. You need energy to do that as well. So if I'm going to make an investment, I want to invest in the machine that gives me the best bang for the buck. And that's not wind and solar. They don't give you that. So if I want to put, my first priority is to go full speed ahead, nothing, the same as JFK went to the moon, only saving the earth. We have found, I know you all agree with this, but when you look at, we can't and CO2 faster than with nuclear power. If I'm going to, even if it costs me more, the real need is to reduce that. So we have to educate people. We spend the money there, even if it did cost more. I don't believe it will, because as an industrial engineer and in construction, we can, process is so archaic, and every new nuclear plant, the one before, that's been the problem, and that's where they collect the data on the cost of nuclear.
All right, Charles, thank you. We have a number of more questions that came in through the chats. One question was, again, back to Unit 2, whether this can be restarted legally and technically. The situation, the technical situation on Unit 2 is indeed that the core, the nuclear core in there is somewhat depleted and cannot output 100% of the power anymore. So if we want it to be restarted, it needs to be refueled. Entergy, the operator, supposedly has not ordered a fuel unit, and that is supposed to take 1 year from ordering to delivery. The regulator, or the PSC, the Public Service Commission in New York, actually claims it takes 18 months. They really want to shut down this unit. So maybe that's why they think it's 18 months, but let's assume it takes 1 year. And then there are also some legal questions about the license to operate it past this April. This is all a very complicated matter, but the main problem is in the closure agreement between Cuomo, Riverkeeper, and Entergy, the operator. And our position is that if there is a political will, and we argue there is actual need for Indian Point to continue operating, and if Cuomo agrees with this and exercises his political power and makes it attractive for Entergy to continue operating this, then Riverkeeper is alone in this agreement. And I think that the legal, it needs to be remain legally whether Riverkeeper can insist on the agreement being followed through in the very end, or whether it's really only just a piece of paper that Cuomo can crush with his political clout.
So one thing to point out is that New York State has recognized the value of zero carbon nuclear generation. So in 2017, New York State gave upstate nuclear plants a social cost of carbon equivalent payment for their zero emissions generation. Unfortunately, probably due to political pressure, downstate Indian Point did not receive that. So if you remember that chart I showed earlier, electricity prices have gone from $80, $100 per megawatt hour down to $20 per megawatt hour today. But on top of that, for wind and solar, they get $20 or $20 at federal level, $20 at the state level to make them push them into the grid. But for upstate nuclear got something like $17 per megawatt hour. So for Indian Point, there is no reason, especially in this current gas prices, gas-driven electricity prices, there's absolutely no reason to deny Indian Point those zero emission credits. And that's probably essential if you want Entergy or any other willing buyer to keep this operational.
And just to add, maybe for general overview of what is going on in the United States power market, basically, for those who are just tuning into the matter right now, we all hear that gas is in retreat, and some are celebrating the retreat of nuclear. The elephant in the room is the cheap fracked gas that is dominating the electricity generation and plays very well, even with intermittent sources coming from solar and wind generation. And with gas prices being so low, we shouldn't be surprised that coal is disappearing and that all these nuclear power plants, or the operators, are losing interest in fighting for their continued operation and paying for mandated upgrades and things like that. And that is driving the decline of nuclear generation in the United States. And it's not the decline of coal is not a success of regulation, and the decline of nuclear is not a success of the anti-nuclear movement. The decline of both is a result of gas getting so incredibly cheap, and it is not, nobody's winning here. The environment is suffering and paying dearly for this win that gas is gaining here.
Very well said. Can I speak? Yeah. Well, that brings up a point, actually, what you just mentioned, is that people tend to forget that Entergy is actually huge in the gas business. It is one of the largest gas suppliers in the United States. And reading their annual reports already way back in 2010 and 2015, 16, they already foreshadowed in the annual reports that they were less interested in nuclear power. Matter of fact, they were actually starting to enhance renewables, and that is why we are now, they are not alone in that, and that is why we are now in this weird relationship that renewables are and natural gas are kind of working together, with implications, especially by people like Schellenberger, that there is a relationship between the 100% renewable stand of people like the Share Club and funding from large fossil companies, especially gas companies. What is your take on that?
We have another question coming in from Brad Rampel via Facebook about the question exactly on and that's why I'm answering it right here, the economics and who's paying for the shutdown. I guess the assumption behind this is that this is shutting down Indian Point is costing the consumer or somebody. No, the gas prices here in New York State, as Isura I think explained very well, are dictated or the electricity prices are dictated by the gas price. Nuclear power at this time is taking the prices, accepting the prices, and our assumption is that Entergy is actually running a loss. The operating costs, they employ about 900 people over there at that plant, and from our research, the average salary there is north of $100,000 for a full-time position. That is a huge burden. And this money has to be made, and then they have to pay for the fuel, of course. And so our assumption is that that Entergy is actually subsidizing the plan at this moment and can't wait to get out of this. So we would have to get these zero emission credits for them first before they join this effort.
That's right. I mean, you're right. But Entergy, we don't have to cry for Entergy because they also closed several plants in the Northeast, as you well know. And that was definitely a corporate strategy in which they were working at very hard. But you're right, they do it at a loss. But that is, I think they were less, they were not very vigorous in the defense of Indian Point, what I can see. You know, they allowed documentarians in the plant. They didn't resist Riverkeeper that much, I think. So it was kind of, oh great, let them do that. So we look good actually. So I'm a little bit aware of their participation, and I think gas should be taxed. There should be a very high carbon tax on gas producers.
We're coming up on 5:30 in New York time. So can Gary or Dietmar, Valerie, if you're around, can you talk about what we are doing about this? What can anybody who's listening do about this?
I could take that if nobody else wants it. All right, thanks guys. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for putting this on. I've been monitoring Facebook and trying to, tunnel questions over here, and there's a nice conversation happening there. Yes, the reason we have these things isn't purely to tease out the fine-tuned details of the economics of the situation, or it's part of it is a group therapy session of how messed up this really is. But at the end of that, you got to make a change in your life, right? You got to do something about it. And because of the work of many of the activists on this call and elsewhere, we have a few opportunities to do that. Number one, if you haven't signed that change.org petition, started by the good man Keith. God, there's so many Keiths in nuclear. I'm spaced on his last name. Thank you. Yeah, we can go ahead and sign that one on change.org. There's the Generation Atomic Action. It's especially good if you live in New York because you will email your state senator and your state representative in addition to Andrew Cuomo. You can also make calls. Put that in the chat here. It's bit.ly /save Indian Point. Climate Coalition has a fantastic letter that we should sign on to. I think it had like 100 signatures of some very smart people. I am with my little master's degree in applied public policy. We got a lot of PhDs in there, including many of the people who were hosting this call and talking us through, some smart folks. So sign all of those things. I think there needs to be a follow-up to this that is really focused on this question of what we can do as well, because we have a few days left. We need to call attention to this. I think we gotta try to get to Bloomberg on this, and I'm sure he's focused on the election as much as anybody. But I think there's an opportunity there. But yeah, we'll keep having that conversation, figure out over the course of the next week, and there's lots to do. I am actually having one more thing. Sorry. On Saturday, having New York resident and peer-reviewed rapper who has done an entire album called the Rap Guide to Climate Chaos is going to be on our live stream and that's 1 o'clock Eastern. And he has been working on a nuclear rap song for a while, and we might get a taste of it on Saturday. The initial intention was to have this be a part of the the final push for Indian Point Unit 2, but this artist, as well as many others, have seen a large life change because of the pandemic, including having to take care of kids. So we might not have the full finished song by the 30th. We'll try our best. At least maybe it'll help us save Unit 3. I don't know. But many exciting
you want to
things.
mention, Tima, you want to mention the visual?
Yes. So we're doing it first this year. So on April 30th, that's next Thursday, a week from now, the reactor number 2 is being powered down, and a lot of people believe this is final. And for this occasion, we thought we will do a vigil. The location that we picked so far. So it sounds like we're just planning this, and that's right. We have been so busy with this presentation and the Earth Day activities that this hasn't fully been fleshed out yet. The location would be at the Ravenswood generating plant in Astoria, Queens. That's right on the East River at 38th Avenue. There's enough space for us to do a socially distanced little protest, and we tie the expected increased pollution from that plant that is right in Asthma Alley here in Queens, where people are already suffering from pollution, and where the shutdown of Indian Point will result in more pollution and more people dying right there. And we tie these things together and have the first protest probably to protect and like people outside with signs saying "Save Indian Point," and I think that might be a first dedicated to Indian Point. I think there were similar protests in California for Diablo Canyon and other nuclear power plants. Indian Point had it coming, and we finally show up. So it will be probably next Thursday around 6 o'clock for that, perhaps. Yeah.
We have Valerie Gardner, who's in the Climate Coalition. Please, Valerie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for that presentation. Really good, really dynamite. There's some great information, those slides. I think we need to be sharing information about the fact that renewables and nuclear are both clean energy, which is really what our goal is. And that shutting it down because it's not renewable energy just makes no sense. So, right now, thank you everybody for your help on the campaign, for tweeting, for using our hashtag Save Indian Point, and for everyone who has signed the petition that Keith started at change.org, and for going and signing the letter that's at the Climate Coalition website. climatecoalition.org/Dear Governor Cuomo is where you would find it. But right now, there's a lot of things happening in the news between COVID, between Michael Moore's movie. We're probably not going to get the press that we would like about this campaign, but I think some of that other news is going to die down. And between now and April 30th, we still need to make a very big social media push and hopefully a media push to get attention to this issue, because even though the chances are fairly slight that we'll see any change or hear anything from Cuomo's office, the information about this, that people recognize that nuclear is clean energy in and of itself, is an important piece of information that most people don't even know. And that climate action plans, as we learned from Leonard, very important that they be effective and really get to address the problem of climate change. If we're having nice sounding policies that are all green but are not actually doing the job, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. So the idea is to keep sending out those messages, because that it'll take a lot of repeating and hearing that message for people to get the idea. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for this great presentation. And when you have information about your next in-person protest action, let us know. We want to get that up onto the campaign site right away.
Thank you,
at
Valerie. Thank you for your
climatecoalition.org.
support.
Yes.
Big thank you.
Thank you.
I also wanted to add in there that as far as the messaging that will happen, at least for the next couple weeks, make sure you try to state that these are environmentalists that are encouraging nuclear as a climate solution, not exclusive of renewables, but just stating, hey, we're environmentalists and this is the right thing to do.
Exactly.
So I think that will go a long ways. And even if we can't prevent the ultimate shuttering of Indian Point 2, we can make great strides with that messaging to help us be more successful for the next round. So, but also too, Valerie's working with professional publicists, and we're not sure what might come up here in the next few days or a couple of weeks, but there may be some high-profile publicity events going on. So definitely stay tuned, keep tweeting and posting, and that's going to help a lot.
Gary, thank you. And let me also add that if you go to climatecoalition.org and join, you can select a button to be part of the Save Diablo Canyon campaign, which probably we'll start talking about in the next few months, maybe over the summer. Because one of the things we'll do is we'll take lessons learned from this campaign and try to wrap them into a much more thought out, well-planned, and not last-minute campaign to really draw attention to these issues and educate the public and develop the materials. I mean, I think heading into this campaign was, we weren't all prepared with social media. We weren't all sort of on the same page as to what exactly we needed to do, and we kind of threw it together, and I think we've done a pretty good job, but I'd like to see us get more effective and use what we've learned from this to do better. So please go to climatecoalition.org and sign up as a member, and you can, if you're interested in helping with the final week or two of this Save Indian Point campaign, you can still join our Slack group. So there's still lots to do. Thanks.
So, we are coming up on 5:42. So I just wanted to say thank you everybody for joining us. We know that we don't have all the answers, but we are very keen to have respectful dialogue with people who don't necessarily agree with us, and that's great. We want to build a coalition as broad as possible to answer the questions that we don't know and to come at it from different angles. We are collaborating with a large and growing group of scientists, climatologists, public health officials, and policy experts at nuclearnewyork.org or nuclearny.org and at climatecoalition.org. So really, thank you so much for joining and spending all this time with us. We can do this, and we really would love your help doing that.
Yeah, and one quick apology to all the questions that we haven't been able to answer yet. There were a number of questions that we didn't get to. If you could send them to us by email, let's say, to info@nuclearny.org, we will get back to you, and we take your questions seriously, of course, and try to answer them to the best of our knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, shall we close it? Shut it down?
Well, maybe you want to make sure you copy all of the questions from the chat panel before you do, because then I don't think you can preserve them otherwise. So if you copy them all, you will have what everybody has asked already. And,
yes.
And save all the links that have been listed so we can share those.
I've saved the chat. The entire presentation also has been recorded. So we will have the audio and video of it for future reference. I guess maybe that does not include in the chat protocol, but I just made sure we have it. Thank you.
Thanks.
And we're not shutting down this campaign, Valerie. If you're saying we only have another week and for the end of the campaign, our campaign will continue. There's still Indian Point 3, and then it'll take a few months for the license to be transferred to Entergy, and we try to make sure that is not going to happen. So
Interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about what phase 3 of the campaign is. Next time we have a chance to chat, Dietmar.
yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dietmar. Thanks, Isuru. Everyone else, it was really great. I hadn't met Paul before, so great hearing your insights. Thanks, guys. Have a great
And
rest
thank you,
of your
Eric,
day.
for your support in the campaign as well. We thanked
Hey.
Valerie profusely, and you were enormous help as well.
Oh,
Thank
hey,
you.
absolutely. Do what I can.
Thank you all. Great
Keep
team.
fighting. Absolutely. All right. We'll see you guys.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Good job.